because I was on sabbatical.
I'm going to
and
give you
I
guys a
went
little
to Southern
introduction
for
the event today, just before Valentin arrives up here. So I want to thank you all for attending this morning's event, and we're sponsored by the Intercultural and International Student Services and Exploring Latin American Cultures Club here at CSBUSD. My name is Quentin Marshall. I'm a junior biochemistry major here at St. John's, and among my many other interests, I'm also a student coordinator in the McCarthy Center. There are a few instances in my 2 years of service here at the center in which I can recall hosting two such prominent Latin America experts, one of which is a St. John's grad himself. He was also a student coordinator in the Eugene McCarthy Center, and as you may know, the McCarthy Center is only 11 years young, so you can do the math, but if he worked at the McCarthy Center and we're only 11 years old, he really can't be that old now, and that just adds to the magnitude of what he's done. So Valentin Sierra, originally from Manizales, Colombia, graduated magna cum laude from St. John's in 2010 with a major in political science and a minor in economics. He was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, the National Honor Society, and he was the first international student from St. John's to receive that prestigious distinction. After working in the private sector in Washington, D.C. and Columbia following graduation, he returned to graduate school at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where he received a Master's of International Economics and Finance. He is currently a Master of Public Policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, Massachusetts, serving as a fellow at the Harvard Graduate School Leadership Institute, and he is president of the Harvard Columbian Student Association. Here in just a few minutes. We also welcome Dr. Pedro dos Santos, Associate Professor of Political Science here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Dr. dos Santos comes from Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, where he was an assistant professor of political science and the director of the International Studies Program. As director of the International Studies Program, he helped revamp the program in the creation of a development studies and a peace and conflict studies concentration. He also taught a variety of courses in comparative politics and international relations, including courses on sustainability in Latin America, courses focusing on gender development, and a study away short course on race and politics in Brazil. Dr. dos Santos has two main areas of research in Brazilian politics: women's representation in the legislative and executive branches, and the rise of evangelical politicians in the country. He's published numerous book chapters as well as articles, and he is currently working on a co-authored book-length project examining the impact of the presidency of Dilma Rousseff, Brazilian's first woman president. So without further ado, would you please give Dr. dos Santos and Valentin. We'll have to give another one when he walks in.
So, yeah, we'll have Pedro. Why don't you start? Yeah, okay. And we'll get Valentin queued up here in a second.
Sounds good. So, I think what I'll start talking about is and mine is really quickly, talk a little bit about the political context, in Latin America, broadly speaking, but also in the context of Brazil's recent election. We just elected Jair Bolsonaro, which was rose from infamy to become the president of Brazil, and I can talk more about that in our discussion. So I want, and this is really quickly, and this is I found this from the Brazilian report. So this goes fast. I can't stop this, but it's just to show you what they call the pink tide, which is the beginning in the 2000s of leftist governments becoming the norm in Latin America from around 2001 up until 2013, right? And now you see like the going from the left and then slowly, all of a sudden, going back to the right? So, and I can go back to that later on because it's just fascinating to see like it is like a tide, right? Now some countries come in, Venezuela first, then Brazil, then Bolivia, then Ecuador, and you start seeing those countries all leaning to the left, and some of them going way to the left, like Venezuela, right? And then now we have this overcorrection to a certain extent, with people like Bolsonaro in Brazil. And again, I can talk more about this, a little later on, as we know, after Valentin talks a little bit about his economic aspects here. But I just want to talk about Brazil in the in the Latin American context, as where we were during the pink tide and where we are now, right? So from 2002 to 2016, the Workers' Party, ran the government. There was actually elected 4 times for the presidency, right? So 2 times with Lula, then 2 times with Dilma being elected. So it was a long time, at the presidency, at a country where the presidency does have a lot of power, a lot of policy-making power, and a lot of purse power as well, right? So the key for the Workers' Party, that's where the left comes, and that's what the left comes in the context of international relations too, is that there is an increased intent on the South-South relations, right? An interesting quote that I heard before is from Cardoso, that was the president before Lula, which was much more, kind of a centrist, center-right, that he claimed that he would rather be the last country of the first world than the first country of the third world, right? And I think that actually it's a good way of thinking about this, where Lula actually wants to be the leader of the third world, right? So the South countries. So the increase of South-South relations was very important during that time. Regional integration through Mercosur and UNASUR, Mercosur being more of a trade development, and UNASUR being more of a political and sometimes even a defense mechanism for countries to interact with, were a priority for Lula and then for Dilma after that. And then they applied a new developmentalist approach to the economic policies, both domestically and internationally, which is state intervention as a big part of economic development, right? So it's not necessarily that the government is involved directly into owning firms and things like that, but the government do pick winners to a certain extent, right? And it was a model used for most of this period. Again, there's a combination of this and other problems in Brazil, and I can go into detail later on if needed. That led to a major economic crisis in 2014. And the other thing is BRICS. Brazil was hopeful that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa could become a bloc that could actually, to a certain extent, counter-propose some of the ideas that come from the United States, from the Washington Consensus and from the European Union as well. So in 2016. Dilma Rousseff was elected in 2014, and she was impeached in 2016, right? Again, I can definitely go into detail on this one, but that'll be a whole other talk, right? So she got replaced by her vice president, who actually orchestrated the whole impeachment thing. Again, long story. And in the context of economic policy specifically, really moved all the way already to the right, right? Like neoliberal policies, free trade, and a push to change labor laws, push to change Social Security contributions and how it works, and then eventually opening the economy to a certain extent for an export-based economy, right? Specific distancing from Venezuela, especially, right? Especially, Venezuela is going through its own economic crisis at this point, right? And it calls a non-ideological diplomacy, right? And then again, in the context of this ideological debates between left and right, non-ideological does mean actually neoliberal, right? It means that we're going to go with free trade, as if free trade is not an ideology, right? So that's kind of the idea, and realigning with neoliberal policies, and also again sending some messages to the United States, where Lula was much more about Brazil is the regional superpower. The United States needs to deal with their problems up north. Temer was much more. He welcomed much more have a stronger relation with the United States specifically, right? So again, so we elected Bolsonaro just last week, actually, right? So now this is really really soon. So I'm just based on the things that we know for sure, right? So. He hired Paulo Guedes as his minister for the economy, and I mean, if you know anything about the history of economic policy in the world, he went to the University of Chicago in the 70s, right? He got a PhD from the University of Chicago in the 70s, right?
I remember the Chicago boy.
Right, he was one of them to a certain extent, right? So he has an ultra neoliberal kind of a way of seeing the world, let's deregulate everything. Privatize everything, and that's kind of again where he thinks he's going to go. Which I have my doubts that it's going to go that far. Going back to this, there's a pendulum going back and forth from left and right. But Bolsonaro himself has said that regional integration is not a priority, and Paulo Guedes as well said that. And there is like a clear approximation between the United States and Israel, which the Bolsonaro already said. Again, Bolsonaro and Trump are the same person, right? Bolsonaro used the same strategies that Trump used here, for better or for worse. And he really actually looks up to Trump for that. And Steve Bannon was involved indirectly into his campaign as well. He was in Brazil for a while during the campaign. So again, there's a lot of connections there already, right? So, and there's a clear approximation to Israel, already talking about putting the Brazilian embassy in Jerusalem and all that. A complete rejection of Venezuela and Cuba, where with the Workers' Party government, there was a connection there. This leftist kind of solidarity, and he basically completely rejects socialism, communism, and said that's an evil that needs to be taken care of. But China has already this week, right? And this is like just reports from this week, the things they said and things people are saying. China already said on China Daily that that's not a good idea, right? The policies that he's proposing are going to go against Chinese interests in Brazil, which are actually quite big with commodities, right? So China is one of the biggest importers of soybeans from Brazil, and Brazil is the largest exporter of soybeans in the world, mainly because of China, right? So again, it's interesting dynamics that come with this economic development and how the proposed policies of somebody that wants to really take this all the way to the right, and all the way to new liberal economic policies, and how the reality of Brazil going through a major economic crisis at this point, how that's going to work. So again, I just want to open with this, and then I'll give Valentin the spot here, and then we can open up for questions and answers after that. So.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry,
Valentin.
traffic was bad.
Tough way to start right off the road, hop right in, but you can do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's see. Yeah, you can just go out of there.
Great, thank you.
There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be here again at home. I'm actually nervous, kind of shaking, but it's because of excitement to be back in my alma mater, the university that completely changed my life for the better, and where I ended up because of a series of very fortunate serendipitous, is the word? Events. So today, so that we go into it right away, I would like to talk to you about what I consider to be some key trends in Latin America, according to my research, according to what some multilateral financial organizations have said, and how some of those trends are relevant to, is this working? My country, Colombia. Okay. So I wanted to talk about some basic characteristics about Latin America. Latin America is a country that has been recovering of basically a recessionary period because of low commodity prices. Latin America is very, very dependent on commodities. So for instance, coal, petroleum, agricultural products, and when we had our golden period is when China was growing at 10% per year, and when we had really that opportunity to send a lot of natural resources to China for their development. This year, is the economy, the overall rate of growth in Latin America is expected to be 2%, but there's a lot of heterogeneity in the region, basically because Chile is very different from Guatemala, and Colombia is very different from Honduras and El Salvador. This is a very convoluted slide, but I wanted to introduce you to the Atlas of Economic Complexity that the Harvard Center for International Development has developed, and that is very informative about why some countries are poor, volatile, and unequal. And basically, it boils down to the complexity of their exports. So basically, this is a peek into the name is not here. This is supposed to say, so what did Colombia export in 2016 versus what did Germany export in 2016? And as we can see, Colombia, as a lot of Latin American countries, most of them, in fact, we export a lot of natural resources. So we're very much dependent on coal, on crude oil, on gold, whereas Germany has a very diversified export basket, and they are focused on high productivity services and high productivity products such as information and communication technologies, cars, and the most complex of them all, human blood. Germany is the only country in the world, actually is horse blood. So anyway, but very complex because they are the only ones that export it. Yet, we are also, our trade openness defined as exports plus imports divided by GDP. We have a long way to go in terms of being open. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is, before I cover this slide, is how this perception that Washington has sold us, the Washington consensus that opening up your borders to trade is generally good for development, is generally good for prosperity, how that has been analyzed, and really there's a person at the forefront, professor at Harvard, Danny Roderick, that has really challenged that view to say opening up your borders when you're not ready really to embrace the benefits of globalization could be actually harmful to your development if there's not enough social fabric or social infrastructure in place to get your country ready for exports from other countries. And so that's the research that I'm going to talk about later on, but I also wanted to point out that contrary to what many may believe, Latin America is a highly dense, populated, concentrated area in the cities. And so, and it's just getting even more dense, and it's getting more urban. And so, for instance, just take the example of Colombia. I mean, 61% of our population is in the city, 76% of our GDP, and we have a problem with density. We have, we are 154 more dense. Colombian cities are 154% more dense than the rest of the world, and even compared to Latin America, we are dense. And it's not the kind of good density such as New York City, where you have a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of people in finance, or Silicon Valley, where there's high density, but it's high-level professionals. We have a lot of density because throughout this period of war and displacement, internal displacement that we had between 1950 and last year, a lot of people migrated to the cities, and that created a lot of poor, impoverished neighborhoods. And so the challenge right now for people like me that want to go back to Colombia and work at the city level is, how do we make sure that that density turns into something that could be leveraged for entrepreneurship, for innovation, for good ideas to flourish? Because right now what we have is problems with crime and with victimization. And so it is a big problem in the region that we have high crime, and that a lot of people are living in cities that are highly populated, and that is really the challenge of public policy. Also in light of the economic trends that we're going to see next. But I just wanted to point out how the homicide rates are really high in Latin America compared to the rest of the world, where in the rest of the world basically is 9 people for every 100,000 people. In Latin America is close to 20, and I mean you have places like El Salvador where it's 60. And in Colombia it's still really high, though I have to say we have improved a great deal since we signed the peace agreement with FARC in 2016. So, and we're seeing the benefits of that. We're seeing that investment, employment, and growth per capita can actually improve exponentially if you get your house in order and if violence decreases. But what I wanted to talk to you about really quickly today is productivity. And this is Economics 101. Economies don't grow in the long term if you don't have increases in productivity. And productivity basically refers to the efficient use of resources, basically decreasing the misallocation of capital investments, improving the way in which you use your resources for innovation. And productivity has actually been declining in Latin America. It's very low. And in economics jargon, productivity is referred to as total factor productivity, so TFP. But whenever you see TFP, it's just referring to productivity. And so what I've been wanting to study throughout the past year and a half is why is productivity so low in Latin America, and how can we make it grow? Because if we don't have productivity, we'll keep continue growing as a region at 1.9%, while the rest of the world is growing at 3.94%. So how can we make productivity increase in a region with low complexity exports, with a lot of informality, with a lot of poverty, and with very few innovation centers? And so, and then studying what the link has been between being, a region that is relatively, that is not very open to trade, but that has been actually signing a lot of trade agreements throughout the past 30 years. So, what is the connection between productivity and trade, and how is that affected by this problem that we have, that is informality? And I'm going to explain that in a second. But basically, the key trends that I wanted, and if there's a slide for the takeaways from my talk, is the fact that trade openness has been increasing in the region, but also as we have been exporting more to China, and we have been receiving a lot of imports from other countries, and we signed a we have been signing free trade agreements with Canada, with the United States, with Europe, with Asia. At the same time that this very seemingly positive trend has been occurring, we have also been decreasing in manufacturing, and this is a phenomenon that is also occurring in the United States. But in the context of developing countries, this is called, in the words of Harvard professor Danny Roderick, premature deindustrialization. We basically did not have this period of prosperity and of high levels of manufacturing, of sustained manufacturing that the United States had for decades after World War II. We did not have enough of that, and basically these high productivity manufacturing jobs have been replaced by low productivity services jobs in an economy that is really not exporting really complex products. And so that is a problem, because then how do we produce that, or how do we get those productivity gains so that we can grow in the long term? Very worrisome. And as we can see, there is a correlation between trade openness going up, which, as we said, compared to the world standards, is not very high, but it's been going up, and productivity decreasing. And informality is a big problem in Latin America, because it fluctuates between 30 and 40% when you consider informality. I mean, when the standard is the percentage of workers that are in some sort of pension system. It's difficult to measure informality, but if you can think about a worker being in a pension system, that's the most standard measure. And for instance, in Colombia, only about 30% of workers are in some sort of pension system. That means that we have a big social problem, because most people would be going into retirement age without any sort of help from an employer, or from some sort of state-sponsored mechanism. And so basically, I used data from the most reputable organizations out there. We run some regressions, and basically what we found is very consistent with what Professor Danny Roderick has been saying, and that is that as you open more your economy in a context of high informality, as you open more your economy to exports and imports, basically your productivity takes a hit. And now that is a correlation, and in economics it's really hard to prove causation, but there is something to be studied there. And it was very consistent in all our regressions, and we used econometric techniques such as instrumental variables to sort of look into trade agreements and their impact on productivity. But the results are very consistent even when you control for education, for income, for infrastructure, for rule of law, which are considered as the key factors to increasing productivity in a region. Again, not very conclusively proven that they are the factors that if you work on those, if you work on increasing your education outcomes, if you work on spending more money on infrastructure, on reducing corruption through better rule of law. I mean, there's not certain proof that will increase productivity, because productivity grows in leaps and bounds. But basically, even when you control for those things, trade openness has seemed to have a deleterious impact on productivity in Latin America, which is very contentious, because the governments in Latin America and in the United States, they all work to basically to tell the business sector to tell the rest of the world that more trade is good for our countries. And I'm not saying that we should stop signing free trade agreements and that we should go back to a model of import substitution. That would be terrible for our economies. But what we need to do is address this issue of informality and to really get our economies ready so that we can take full advantage of globalization. And so it's very worrisome what we find in the data. And I went to Colombia and we did a little case study there, talking to people, talking to government officials. And Colombia is a good case study because our productivity has also been going down more dramatically than other Latin American countries. And although, it's not like productivity is measured by going into every firm and measuring how productive each worker is, how much output they produce per hour, is measured in much more sort of mysterious ways through econometric methods. But it's very clear that we have not been improving in terms of productivity, whereas in other countries it has been going up. And so Colombia was my case study, and after many interviews, basically what I found out is that, this is very much based on qualitative research, but the fact that we have now a peace agreement with the FARC, that a conflict that lasted 60 years, and that and the impact of which was that more than 230,000 Colombians died in that period, because we don't have that conflict anymore, and because we have safer areas in the countryside where companies can invest. We can expect to see an annual growth of 1.9%, which was a very rigorous study conducted based on the experience of other countries such as South Africa, such as El Salvador. And so we're very optimistic, especially also because investment, as in the rest of the region, has been growing compared to last year, and because we are trying to attract more innovative entrepreneurs to the country. And also because we have the largest infrastructure investment program in the region, a $70 billion program. And although Colombia is very well connected among the cities, we have still a long way to go in order to connect the whole country because of our geography. And we have a program, a policy that sort of supports businesses to become more productive. And this, we can go into more detail about this later, but basically we have a long way to go in terms of becoming, or in order to converge to the level of development of advanced economies. But there is hope, because we are investing in the right triggers of productivity, such as education, infrastructure, security, and trade. But we are not tackling much the problem of informality. And I think that is the key issue, that we are really not doing enough, especially because the taxes in Colombia, labor taxes are sort of a mechanism that provides a disincentive for firms to hire more workers formally. And so it's very expensive in the Colombian context for firms to hire new workers, and so we're really not tackling the key problem for increasing productivity, which is informality. So basically that was the key takeaway from my experience talking to people in Colombia. But at the same time, for someone that is studying to go back to Colombia and work on these issues, there's a lot of opportunity to apply what I've learned about this economic phenomena. And we are still lagging behind in terms of corruption and in terms of in the Human Development Index. And but basically there is a lack of political will. And that is something that was also a common denominator in my conversations. If the country really came together in a big consensus to improve or to understand this issue of productivity, to understand this issue of informality, if there was a big national consensus and a lot of political will to tackle that, maybe we could advance towards being more developed, but there's not a lot of conversations to that end, and we're still talking about exporting the same products, and we're not thinking about the future, and we're not talking about the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, biotech as engines of development. So we're still lagging behind. But I just wanted to leave you with my conclusion, which is that I am not saying that trade is bad for Latin America, that opening up to imports is bad for the region. Is that we need to invest in reducing our informality, in preparing our people with the right skills, with the right knowledge, with the right know-how, before we completely open our borders as a result of free trade agreements that we sign with more developed countries, if we want to really improve our productivity in the long run, and if we really want to grow and provide opportunities for prosperity to our people. Thank you. Oh, and I wanted to say one more thing, but I have to read it because it's so dramatic, and it's a few statistics about Venezuela. Basically, all the statistics that these organizations are producing about Latin America, they exclude Venezuela. And why do they exclude Venezuela? Because Venezuela, between 2013 and last year, Venezuela lost 45% of its gross domestic product. 45%. There is no precedent in recent history for the level of decay of Venezuela in economic terms. Its imports have fallen more than 80%, and more than 10% of Venezuela's population has left the country in the last 4 years. Unprecedented. Not only that, but the most dramatic figure, in my opinion, is that the minimum salary in Latin America, we measure minimum wage on a monthly basis. So the minimum monthly wage that in 2012 bought 72,000 calories. And again, the situation is so dramatic that they had to come up with a new measure to measure the catastrophe. And so Professor Ricardo Hausmann at the Harvard Center for International Development came up with this study of, okay, well, let's measure calories and see if maybe we can see how dramatic this decline is from that regard. In 2012, the monthly minimum wage was able to, or allowed you to buy 72,000 calories per day, 72,000 calories. Today, it doesn't buy 800 calories, which is not even 2 eggs. A monthly minimum salary in Venezuela went from allowing you to buy 72,000 calories to 800 calories. And we're talking about the cheapest calorie, which is yuca. And so this is very dramatic for 30 million people that are living in poverty. 80% of Venezuelans are living in poverty, and they have lost more than 25 kilograms. That's 50 pounds. Average, the Venezuelan population has lost on average 50 pounds in their body weight. So this is very dramatic, and I don't think that is being addressed enough in the U.S. That people are not really talking about it much. So it's an invitation for all of you to really consider how dramatic this is and how it needs to be addressed. And hyperinflation, 1,000,000% in inflation. That is even hard to wrap your mind around. So I just wanted to leave you with those dramatic statistics as well.
We have plenty of time for questions.
I want to add a little bit to Valentin's last comment. That's something I was thinking about too, specifically in the context of Colombia. And Brazil and Colombia have a clear interest in what's going on in Venezuela because they're basically economic refugees, right? At this point, people are fleeing. The people who had the means to flee have fled already, right? And now the people who are in the desperate needs are just leaving, walking across the border, and that has major implications for the neighboring countries, specifically Brazil and Colombia, because they're coming to those countries. And Colombia had just signed this peace treaty. This can destabilize that region, especially where FARC was there before, and it's already a big talking point. I know in Colombia too. It is a big talking point in Brazil. It was a talking point during the elections. Something that normally is not a part of elections is discussing, what's going on in your neighboring countries, not necessarily, right? So yeah, it is a major issue, and it can really destabilize the whole. I think, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think Bolsonaro in Brazil is less of a problem to the region than Venezuela's kind of a complete collapse at this point that we're not talking about. So.
Yeah, right now we have we have 1.4 million Venezuelans in Colombia. We expect 4 million. If the situation doesn't change, we expect 4 million in the next year or so. Very dramatic, and we're not ready for. We don't have the infrastructure to really receive so many refugees.
Anti-immigrant sentiment is increasing in both of these countries, and again, that's where you are gotta have to understand the context of it, right? Where if the people who are living, especially in the case of Brazil, I cannot speak for Colombia, but the border towns already don't have a whole lot of resources, right? So when you flood an area with not enough resources with people who those people see as outsiders, right? That leads to, it's a pretty simple, kind of reaction, human reaction, right? So you don't want those people in there. So there have been scenes in Brazil of people setting fires to camps, right? Or literally shooting at people so they can leave, right? So again, that can lead to other problems as well that we have seen in other places. We have not seen something like this in Latin America yet, but this can happen. This is a crisis large enough that this can become an international problem.
So,
I just had a question. One of the ironies that struck me was, Pedro, you talked about how in the new government in Brazil is an admirer of Trump, and also they're in favor of free trade. But Trump himself is completely opposed to free trade for the United States. It might be fine for Brazil to be a free trader with the United States, but Trump's own agenda is strongly protectionist. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think it goes with this more broad ideological, and that's where it gets tricky. When you talk about economic, policy, then each country has their own view of what free trade is, right? So it's more in an ideological sense, right? And again, on campaign strategy. So if you Google, Bolsonaro, I think the first 5 articles in English are going to be Brazil's Trump, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more about just a strategy for winning the election, coming from kind of as an outsider view. But then when he gets elected, and now he has to actually come up with policies, right? And he chose this person to appease, in a way. He himself was a nationalist, like Bolsonaro. Throughout his career in Congress, he voted against almost every single privatization, right, that happened during this last 30 years, right? And then now he basically brought this guy, Paulo Guedes, who was, University of Chicago, again, as neoliberal as you can get, to a certain extent, in a way to appease the business interests who are not necessarily happy with him being president either, because again, it's uncertainty. The market doesn't like uncertainty, right? So he brought him into a peace. So in a way, they call that, it's a marriage of convenience at this point, right? They're both, dealing, pushing their own policies for their own interests. So yeah.
the decline of the Venezuelan GDP, is that completely linked to oil? Or
Can I speak to it a little bit?
Yeah. Well, not completely. It was linked to the falling oil prices that started in 2014 because it was dramatic and they are a petro state. But it also, but I think it's 50%. I think it's 50-50. It's also linked to Chavez's efforts to dismantle the productive capacity of the economy. So, for instance, he nationalized so many companies, and he also basically set fixed prices and didn't let really the market fluctuate because of supply and demand. And so, it's a mix of things. but it was really a concerted effort to make people completely dependent on the state. And they even say that in Venezuela you cannot get a voting card if basically if the state doesn't say that you are a loyal supporter of the Chavez, of the Maduro regime. And so people have all the incentives to say just as the government does, as the government says.
So another interesting point of thinking about Venezuela is that, think about this ideologically, right? So again, Venezuela, Chavez came in, which again, thinking about Bolsonaro looks a lot more like Chavez than he looks like Trump to me, where he came in after the Caracazo, which was basically a push for affordable transportation, right, in Venezuela. So he came in as a nationalist populist, right, and he had again a socialist view of the world, right, you could call it people-centered, but in this ideological kind of mentality. So also what happened during this process was that he made the changes in the Constitution provided a lot of entitlements to the population, right? And again, you can look at this, in the kind of an American context as like entitlements that are like you trying to buy votes, right? And it's part of it is that, right? But part of it is actually ideologically. That's what he saw the world as. He rejects the system, right? So he wants to create a system that is alternative, right? So he created all these entitlements, including like Social Security, unemployment. The setting of prices is part of that, like to allow people to have certain things, right? But one of the problems is this: he put this all on the Constitution, which then makes it, bindable, and you have to do it, and you have to provide these things, and people expect it to be provided to them. And he did all those things when the oil prices were way up. As the oil prices come down, that's the beginning of the end, right? When you have all these entitlements, but you cannot capture anything of that through taxation because the government has all, the system, everything that is coming in through taxation is coming through basically through oil exports because everything else is nationalized, and the informal sector in Venezuela has been and is now even more, even larger than it was before. So, if you look at this bigger picture, there's an ideological fight going on, and there's a lot of mistakes that Chavez made in the context of how to make a country better for the people, right? And that's combination of this and this kind of establishing this as like entitlements that everybody should have, where it's not really feasible to do that. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. How strong is the correlation between like the influx of economic refugees from Venezuela to like the election of right-wing politicians in Latin America?
Is there anything in Colombia specific going on? Actually, so their elections are next year, 2 years from now?
Yeah, so the presidential election was very recent in May, and then runoff in June, and there really wasn't that sort of Trump propaganda sort of spreading fears about immigrants coming into the country. That really wasn't part of the agenda, but I think it's because we don't have the number, the mass of Venezuelans yet in Colombia to kind of make that argument. Because we have 1 million and we're struggling, but when we get to 4 million, I think that it will be a different story.
So that's what I was asking because I don't know that much right now in Colombia, but my guess is that local elections, that's going to probably become a talking point in border regions, right? Where states, so you may see a rise in candidates who are actually campaigning on that kind of policy, right? On anti-immigration policy. And I think in Brazil that was part of the debate, but it wasn't the big reason Bolsonaro won was because most people were anti-Workers' Party, which was the party that ran for 16 years. And that was really, his biggest argument was like, I'm not corrupt. I'm fighting against corruption, I say all these bad things. I say whatever I want, but in the end, I'm not the corrupt party, right? So the immigration debate was not part of it. But again, if this doesn't get resolved, and it doesn't look like it will, and part of it is because nobody's talking about it, right? Then we're gonna probably see problems both, at a state, at a regional level, a subnational level in both these countries, in the border states, and also nationally, that can become a national crisis.
I guess from both of your perspectives, and this is probably the question, but where do you see Venezuela in 5 years? I know that's a big question.
But I can tell you, based on what, President Santos was at Harvard last week, and also the president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and they said that the way things are going in Venezuela, that Maduro probably won't be there in 4 years. I think that's a big statement for someone like a former head of state and Nobel Peace Prize winner to make such a bold statement. So I asked him, are you saying that based on some sort of insider information, or that's just your gut feeling? And he didn't say, but he mentioned that it's not sustainable. Yet there's 1 million paramilitaries with guns ready to use at the government's order, and over 300 four-star generals in Venezuela that are completely loyal to the government. So it's hard to say. And the people are impoverished and malnourished and hungry. But some influential leaders seem to think that Maduro won't be around in 4 years.
Whenever I think of Venezuela at this point, I think also about Zimbabwe, right? I think that's the closest example. It's not the same. I think the regions themselves and the neighbors themselves makes it a little different. Again, because I think both Colombia and Brazil are stable countries, right? But I can think of Zimbabwe and the rule there that's still going on, really. Where even with hyperinflation and poverty and all those things, you're still able to stay in power, and that's the fear of Venezuela. The ideological slant has changed so much to be anti-establishment, anti what most people see as like the way the world works. And it's not how it should work, but how it works. That's my fear. That that may be a longer time. And from the inside, it's going to be hard. For an insider, it's not going to be changes. Maduro may not be there, but I don't think he would be somebody that is, kind of pro free trade or even pro like Washington consensus even at a low level, right? So that's the fear about that. That may be a long, protracted, kind of low level conflict, right? So.
But a very interesting thing to see is that a group of economists led by Ricardo Hausmann, who was the Minister of Finance of Venezuela in the good times, they are getting together every month in Cambridge in a set of really secretive meetings called, they're not that secretive, but they're not announcing it to the world, called Venezuela the Day After. And they're trying to figure out what would be the first measures to implement in the first 24 hours after Maduro goes. So people are talking about it, and people are getting together to plan around this potential scenario, but it may be many, many more years.
And it's tricky because I think anything that happens, Brazil and Colombia will have to be on the forefront. And and Mercosur to a certain extent. So Chile being out of power, not bordering, but being out of power, jurisdictional power, they may have to be in line. And right now, given the governments there are in each country, that may be difficult to be on the same page, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also the other, that's the layer of the domestic, and then they have the international layer that gets a little complicated. So.
Matt, how many more questions? Up to you.
Yeah, we have time, maybe 2 more.
I had a question. So what types of policies do you think are needed in Venezuela in order to stabilize it? Or do you even think it's possible to stabilize it at this point? Or has it gone way too extreme?
I think we can talk about the policies, but they won't be implemented, right?
But in an ideal world.
Yeah, I think that, because it'll be tricky because Venezuela has for so long rejected the system, and again to their credit, if we think about this not in an American perspective, and think about this in a South perspective, right? A lot of things they did were good for other countries, right? So while the price of oil was high, right? They established a development bank. They actually helped a lot of countries get out of the IMF. From the IMF loan, under the IMF loans, right? And Chavez did this again as a way to promote his view of socialism, and arguably allowed Morales in Bolivia and Correa in Ecuador to have, and also Castro in Cuba to have some support, right? So in a way that, again, if you think of it in American perspective, that's all bad, but that's not bad for people who are living there, right? For the average poor person who lives in those countries. So he did a lot of good things, but then like with all that also he became a dictatorship, right? It became a one-person rule, and then when he died, arguably, this is not true, but like a lot of conspiracy theories about like that we gave him cancer, right? The United States gave him cancer. But after he died, Maduro came in, and Maduro just didn't have the same charisma, right? Didn't have the same power, and so Maduro may not be there, but somebody else will. But nobody will do the right. And at this point, it's so complicated that we're gonna need like a bunch of very smart people to like come up with like possible solutions to what's going on.
And they would have to have support from the international community. I don't think that no policy would work in Venezuela with Maduro in power, because the consensus of the international community is right now to choke Venezuela with sanctions, and sort of, just wait until Maduro can take it any longer. But I don't think that there will be a policy that right now could help Venezuela, unfortunately, with Maduro in power.
Could I? Over there.
Go ahead.
Sorry to deter from this very intriguing conversation about Venezuela. My question is regarding Colombia. So, what factors do you think, what prohibits or hinders national dialogues about what you had mentioned before about the fourth industrial revolution and artificial intelligence, and ultimately to muster up the political will to identify and tackle these issues?
Well, I really think that there's three main things, and the brain drain has been one of them. A lot of people have left Colombia. I'm going to return. After I graduate in May, I'm going back. But a lot of people, especially in the very critical areas of life sciences, of information and communication technologies, they get their education subsidized by the government, 100%, 80%, really good education for Latin American standards. They get educated in Colombia and then migrate to places like the United States or Europe, where there's more research and development centers, and where there's a lot more money and they don't have to deal with the day-to-day life in Bogota or in the cities, which could be treacherous with the crime figures that I described and all that. So the brain drain is one thing. Then the fact that there is a lot of concentration of wealth and power in the country, and for instance, the media belongs to only 3 families, and I think that and like that, a lot of industries, and so I think that when people at that level who are really old school also benefit from an economic model that doesn't really see the benefits of breakthrough innovations, I think that that's also a problem, because then there's no political will to really move those conversations forward, and that goes to the third point, which is lobbying. I don't think that there's no one lobbying the Congress or lobbying the government to really start these conversations. There's right now a couple of ministers, a couple of people in the cabinet that are trying to move these conversations forward, but there's no really a massive political will to do it because of the way the economy has been set up and dominated, I think.
Well, just due to the time, I think we want to wrap up there. Please join me in thanking our guests today.